In this example, we're presented with data that relates the size of apartments to the cost of rent. So take a moment to pause the video just to read the full problem statement. And notice that we are only really referring here to the city region. So when I click on View the Apartment Data, the first thing I notice is I've got that city region data here, but I'm also given extra data that I'm just not going to use or need for this particular example. The other thing that I want to do is use StatCrunch in order to answer this particular question. So the first thing that we're asked about is to find the least squares regression line, treating square footage as the explanatory variable. We're also told to round the slope to 3 decimal places and the y-intercept to the nearest integer. So let's go through StatCrunch. I'm going to open my data here in StatCrunch. And again, notice I've got more data than what I need. I'm only going to be referring to these first 2 columns. So I'll go to Stat, Regression, and Simple Linear. Here I'm going to select my X variable to be the city region square footage. That's the size of those apartments in the city. And I want to select my Y variable to be the city region rent. So again, that's the rent of those apartments in the city. Notice, again, I'm not using the county data for any of this. I'm going to compute. And I'm given a whole lot of information here, way more than what I need. I'm also given a graph if I want to go back and compare this graph to the graph that was presented in the original problem. But I want to go back to this one because it also gives me here the least squares regression line. Written out, kind of a little bit wordier, I guess we could say, that y, that's the rent, equals this constant, approximately -34, plus 2.209 times x, the city region square footage. So these are the values that I want to take with me to my equation on the MyMathLab screen. This is one thing I do like about StatCrunch is I can copy that particular value, come back to the problem, and paste it in here for the slope. Now, here's another thing I've noticed about StatCrunch versus the way that we write equations. Remember back in StatCrunch, it was giving me the y-intercept first as part of that equation. Here in MyMathLab, we're given slope times x. That's the way we would write this, plus the y-intercept. That y-intercept being -34. Then we're asked some follow-up questions here, like to interpret the slope, what does that mean, and maybe even fill in some values as well. So remember our slope was 2.209. What that tells me is that on average, this would always be some type of average, for each additional square foot of floor area, the rent is going to increase by 2.21 because this is in dollars. Remember the y-intercept was -34. If I interpret that or start to interpret that in the context here, this would be the rent of an apartment with 0 square footage. In other words, I would pay -$34 to rent an apartment that is not even there. And in this case, that doesn't make any sense in this context. And for this last example, we're asked, what's the rent on an 825 square foot apartment, and to compare it with the data. So here I'm going to use my calculator and my original, that linear regression equation that we just found. So I'm going to type in that equation, but instead of x, I will substitute the value that's given in part C, the 825, plus a -34. And now I've got this rent. I need to write that in dollars and cents though, so that's going to be $17.88.43. Oh, and one more thing I have to do is I have to compare it to what the data says. So let me go back to that data, an apartment with 825 square feet, according to the data, should cost $1,250. Notice that what the line is telling me, the linear regression line is telling me, is on average it should be more than that. So the data is less. Just make sure that we're making the correct statement here when we're comparing those two. So it's specifically saying, is the rent on that apartment in the data, notice in the data that's below what we were just finding there from the linear regression line, because the linear regression line said that it should be $1,788.43.